November 2019. The air smelled like old paper and mold when Detective Marcus Chen opened the rusty evidence locker in the basement of the Allegheny County Courthouse. The metal door made a loud groaning sound on hinges that hadn't moved in over 30 years. Inside, there was a falling-apart cardboard box marked Brooks, Sophie Ann, 1983, unsolved. In the box was a wool coat stained with rain and something darker. The coat had been waiting 36 years for technology that didn't exist when it was first stored. Chen pulled the evidence tag toward the bright light and read the faded handwriting. Recovered from dumpster behind Greyhound Station, Pittsburgh, PA, March 14, 1983. He didn't know it yet, but the tiny skin cells trapped in that coat's fabric would finally answer a question that had bothered Pittsburgh streets for more than half a lifetime. What happened to Sophie Brooks on the night she disappeared from the corner of Liberty Avenue and 10th Street? Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. The notification showed up on Detective Marcus Chen's computer screen at exactly 9:43 a.m. on a cold Monday morning in November 2019. Chen had been working cold cases for the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police for nearly 7 years. That was long enough to recognize the special weight that certain alerts carried before his brain fully understood what they meant. The CODIS database match had been waiting in his inbox for less than 20 minutes, where the case number made him pause mid-sip of his coffee. Brooks, Sophie Ann, missing person, March 1983, file last updated. April 1984. Chen leaned back in his standard office chair. It was the kind that had been ordered in bulk sometime during the previous decade and never replaced. The Criminal Investigation Division was on the 3rd floor of a city building on 2nd Avenue. The windows looked out over the Allegheny River and showed a view of the city that had changed a lot since Sophie Brooks had last walked its streets 36 years ago. Chen had worked cases that stretched back to decades, even 3 on rare occasions. But something about the mid-80s felt like a completely different time of law enforcement. In 1983, DNA profiling was still 3 years away from its first use in solving crimes. The term genetic fingerprint existed only in science journals that most police departments would never see. Yet here, shown in the medical language of forensic database systems, was clear proof that a genetic profile taken from evidence collected in March 1983 matched the DNA of Gerald Wayne Tucker. He was a 64-year-old man currently locked up at the Belmont Correctional Institution in St. Clairsville, Ohio. Tucker's DNA had been collected in August 2018. After his arrest for serious assault and domestic violence, his profile had entered the system only 14 months ago. It was part of Ohio's expanded rules for collecting genetic material from violent criminals. Chen pulled up the original case file. You watched the scanned documents load with a painful slowness that seemed to describe every computer system in city government. The file had been digitized in 2016 as part of a project to save falling-apart paper records, but the scanning had been done quickly by contractors who clearly hadn't understood the material they were processing. Some pages were crooked, others were partially cut off at the edges, and several important photographs had been scanned at such low quality that they looked like little more than gray squares. The first document to load was Sophie Brooks's missing person report. It was filed on March 17, 1983, by her mother, Diane Marie Brooks of Erie, Pennsylvania. The report had been typed on a manual typewriter whose lowercase e struck slightly higher than the other letters. This created a special pattern that Chen had learned to connect with documents from that time. Sophie Ann Brooks, white female, age 19, last seen March 13, 1983. At about 11 p.m. at the intersection of Liberty Avenue and 10th Street in downtown Pittsburgh. Height, 5 feet 4. Weight about 110 pounds. Hair blonde, shoulder length. Eyes blue. Special marks. Small scar on left eyebrow from childhood accident. Known to work as a prostitute in the Liberty Avenue area. That final line carried a weight that Chen had learned to recognize in cold case files from the 70s and 80s. Known to work as a prostitute was often official shorthand for low investigation priority. It was 4 cases that got minimal resources and even less continued attention. Chen had seen it dozens of times in files from that time. It was coded language that showed certain victims were considered less worthy of justice than others. The investigating officer had been Detective Paul Horvath. He had retired from the Pittsburgh Bureau in 1991 and died of emphysema in 2006. Investigation notes were detailed by the standards of 1983, but they showed the limitations of the tools available to him. He had done interviews with 11 other women working in the Liberty Avenue prostitution zone. He contacted local hospitals and morgues throughout western Pennsylvania, and he worked with the Pennsylvania State Police to check for Jane Doe discoveries that might match Sophie's description. The search had lasted less than 3 weeks before pressure from bosses in other cases demanded Horvath's attention elsewhere. Chen scrolled through the evidence inventory, looking for the item that had created the CODIS alert. Evidence item 7. 1 women's wool coat, brown, size medium, recovered from dumpster behind Greyhound bus terminal. 55 11th Street, Pittsburgh. On March 16, 1983, the coat had been discovered by sanitation worker Raymond Mitchell during his regular collection route. Mitchell had noticed the coat because of visible blood staining on the right shoulder and what looked like tears in the fabric from a violent struggle. The coat had been photographed, recorded, and sent to the Allegheny County Crime Laboratory for testing. The 1983 crime lab report was hard to read. Blood type, O positive, matches Sophie Brooks's medical records. Multiple fiber samples collected from coat surface. Origin unknown. Fabric tears match forceful contact or struggle. Recommendation: keep for future testing as forensic abilities improve. Someone in that lab 36 years ago had been smart enough to understand that evidence collected today might give answers tomorrow using technologies that hadn't yet been invented. That smart thinking was paying off now. Chen pulled up the extra forensic report that had triggered the CODIS match. In October 2019, as part of Pittsburgh's cold case project, the Brooks evidence had been sent to the Pennsylvania State Police DNA Laboratory in Greensburg. Forensic scientists had used advanced methods to recover genetic material from skin cells trapped in the wool fibers of Sophie's coat. The techniques they used were called differential extraction and YSTR analysis. These were methods that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who first handled that coat in 1983. The genetic profile, taken from those tiny skin cells, belonged to someone other than Sophie Brooks. The profile was complete enough to be entered into CODIS with high confidence, and within 6 weeks, the system had found a match. Gerald Wayne Tucker. Chen opened a new window and began researching Tucker's background. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with understanding that he was looking at a suspect who had been living freely for more than 3 decades after killing someone. Tucker had been born in 1955 in Youngstown, Ohio. That made him 28 years old when Sophie Brooks disappeared. His criminal record stretched back to 1975. It painted a picture of increasing violence against women that should have raised red flags decades earlier. Tucker's first arrest had been for asking for prostitution in Cleveland in 1977. Over the following decades, he had piled up charges for assault, domestic violence, harassment, and multiple violations of protection orders. Most importantly, Tucker had been living in Pittsburgh from 1981 through 1985. He lived in an apartment on Penn Avenue, LESS, then 2 miles from where Sophie Brooks was last seen. He had worked on and off as a truck driver and warehouse loader. These were jobs that gave him the ability to move around in irregular schedules that would have made his movements hard to track. Chen pulled up Tucker's most recent mugshot. It was taken in August 2018 at the time of his Ohio arrest. The face that stared back from the screen belonged to a man who had lived 64 years carrying the weight of what he had done. Deep lines creased Tucker's forehead and surrounded his mouth. His gray hair was cut short in the style common to men who had spent time in prisons, but his eyes were what held Chen's attention. They were pale blue and empty of the warmth that should have developed over a lifetime of human connection. The Ohio arrest report gave more information. Tucker had been charged with serious assault after beating his girlfriend badly enough to require hospitalization. The incident had happened in their shared apartment in St. Clairsville. Neighbors who called police witnessed it. Tucker had been drunk at the time of his arrest. He had made statements to arresting officers that showed a pattern of violence stretching back decades. One officer's report noted that Tucker had commented, "She's not the first one who got what was coming to her." Chen understood that he was looking at something that went far beyond Sophie Brooks's disappearance. Tucker's history suggested he had a pattern of violence against vulnerable women. This was behavior that had been allowed by a criminal justice system that treated assaults on sex workers and domestic partners as minor crimes, not worthy of serious investigation or long jail time. How many other women had suffered because Tucker had never been properly investigated after Sophie disappeared? The morning sunlight shifted across Chen's desk as he continued reading through the piled-up documents. Outside his window, Pittsburgh's skyline rose against the November sky. It had changed from the steel-producing industrial center it had been in 1983 into something more modern and economically different. But some things hadn't changed. Women still disappeared from city streets. Some cases still got more attention than others based on decisions about whose life was considered valuable enough to deserve continued investigation. Chen reached for his phone to call the Allegheny County District Attorney's office. After 36 years, Sophie Brooks was finally going to get the justice that should have been pursued in 1983, but Chen couldn't shake the knowledge that this justice was coming far too late. It was being delivered only because technology had finally caught up with evidence that had been waiting in a basement evidence locker for more than half of Sophie's mother's lifetime. Sophie Ann Brooks was born on April 3, 1964, at Hammett Medical Center in Erie, Pennsylvania. She was delivered at 6:42 a.m. after 17 hours of labor that nearly killed her mother. Diane Marie Brooks, 19 years old and unmarried, held her daughter for the first time in a hospital room where the morning light came through window blinds that cast striped shadows across the white hospital sheets. The birth certificate listed the father as unknown, but Diane would later tell Sophie that her father had been a mechanic named David, who had left Erie 3 weeks after learning about the pregnancy and never returned. The apartment where Diane raised Sophie was on the second floor of a falling-apart Victorian house on West 22nd Street, 3 blocks from the Lake Erie shoreline. Diane worked as a nurse's aide at St. Vincent Hospital. She took double shifts whenever possible to cover rent and childcare expenses that ate up nearly everything she earned. The apartment's windows rattled during winter storms. When wind came off the lake, carrying snow and the metallic smell of cold water, Sophie learned to sleep through the noise. She curled under quilts that Diane's mother had made before her death in 1969. The blankets smelled faintly of mothballs and represented the only inheritance Diane had received from her family. Sophie's childhood was marked by the instability that comes with poverty that isn't quite desperate enough to qualify for help but severe enough to make every month a careful calculation of which bills could be delayed. Diane kept a ledger in the kitchen drawer where she tracked expenses in neat handwriting. The numbers never quite balanced, no matter how carefully she budgeted. Sophie wore clothes from church donation bins. She learned early not to ask for things she saw in store windows or on television commercials. Her birthday gifts came from thrift stores. They were carefully picked by Diane during lunch breaks and wrapped in newspaper comics, because wrapping paper was an expense that couldn't be justified. Despite the money problems, Diane kept certain routines that gave structure to their lives. Sunday mornings meant attending St. Patrick's Catholic Church on Peach Street. Sophie sat beside her mother in a wooden pew, worn smooth by generations of people. Diane wasn't particularly religious, but she valued the community and the sense of continuity the church provided. It was at St. Patrick's that Father Robert Donnelly gave Sophie the small silver crucifix that would become her most treasured possession. It was presented on the occasion of her first communion in 1972. The crucifix hung from a delicate chain that Diane said had belonged to her own mother. It was a connection to family history that meant more than the material value of the silver itself. Sophie attended McKinley Elementary School and later East High School. Her school record showed the distraction of a home life ruled by money stress and mother absence. Diane's double shifts meant that Sophie spent most afternoons and many evenings alone in the apartment. She was responsible for heating her own dinners and completing homework without help. Her grades stayed between C's and D's. It wasn't because she lacked intelligence, but because education seemed increasingly unimportant compared to the immediate reality of survival. Teachers noted in her file that Sophie was withdrawn, prone to daydreaming, and often absent on Mondays when the previous weekend had left Diane too tired to make sure her daughter woke on time for school. By age 15, Sophie had developed the kind of watchful intelligence that comes from growing up in places where adults are too overwhelmed to provide steady guidance. She understood without being told that her mother loved her, but Diane's love was complicated by tiredness and resentment at circumstances that had trapped them both in lives neither had chosen. Sophie began staying out later. She spent time with other teenagers whose home situations mirrored her own. These were kids who gathered in parking lots and along the bayfront because they had nowhere else to go where they felt like they belonged. The argument that led to Sophie's leaving happened on a Friday evening in October 1983. Weeks after her 16th birthday, Diane had come home from a particularly difficult shift at the hospital to find Sophie in the apartment with 2 older boys Diane didn't recognize. There was the smell of marijuana, even though the windows were open. What followed was the kind of fight that had been building for years. It was fueled by Diane's fear and Sophie's resentment at being monitored by a mother who was rarely present. The specific words were lost to the heat of the moment, but the ending was clear. Sophie packed a duffel bag with clothes. She took the small amount of money she had saved from occasional babysitting jobs, and she left the apartment while Diane sat at the kitchen table crying too hard to form words. Sophie reached Pittsburgh on a Greyhound bus that left Erie at 11 p.m. and arrived at the downtown terminal at 2:30 a.m. She had chosen Pittsburgh because it was close enough to feel manageable but far enough to represent real escape. It was a city large enough to disappear into but not so overwhelming as Philadelphia or New York. The bus terminal at that hour was filled with displaced and desperate people traveling at odd hours because of circumstances that didn't fit conventional schedules. Sophie sat on a plastic bench with her duffel bag clutched against her chest. She watched the other passengers and understood with sudden clarity that she had no plan beyond getting away from Erie. The first weeks in Pittsburgh were a blur of survival decisions made with the limited resources available to a 60 with no work history, no references, and no legal guardian. Sophie stayed initially at a youth shelter on the north side. It was a place run by Catholic charities that provided temporary housing for runaways and homeless teenagers. The shelter had strict rules about curfews and required counseling sessions. These were structures that Sophie found both comforting and suffocating after the neglect of her home life. She lied about her age and circumstances. She claimed to be 18 and separated from an abusive family. This was a story common enough among shelter residents that no one investigated too carefully. Work proved impossible to find through legal channels. Without a high school diploma or work permits, Sophie was limited to cash-paid labor that existed in the gray economy of a city where unemployment remained stubbornly high despite national economic recovery. She tried waitressing at diners that didn't ask too many questions. She cleaned hotel rooms for contractors who paid below minimum wage, and eventually she drifted into the Liberty Avenue area where other young women in similar circumstances had discovered that sex work paid better than any other option available to them. The transition into prostitution wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no single moment of decision that Sophie could later point to as the turning point. It began with accepting rides from men who offered money for conversation. It progressed to more clear transactions that she could rationalize as temporary necessity, and eventually it became the primary way she paid for the single-room hotel where she lived in a building on Penn Avenue that smelled permanently of mildew and cooking grease. The women who worked Liberty Avenue developed informal networks of protection and information sharing. They warned each other about violent customers and dangerous pimps. They looked out for one another in ways that law enforcement and social services never did. Sophie kept occasional contact with her mother during this period. Phone calls every few weeks followed a predictable pattern. Diane would beg Sophie to come home, promising that things would be different, that they could work out their problems if Sophie would just return to Erie. Sophie would avoid and lie, offering vague promises that she was fine, that she had found work and a place to live. She carefully left out any details that would reveal the reality of her circumstances. These conversations satisfied neither woman but kept a connection that both needed despite their inability to bridge the distance between them. The silver crucifix remained around Sophie's neck through everything. It was a charm that connected her to a version of herself that still believed in the possibility of redemption. She wore it tucked beneath her clothing when she worked, hidden from view like a secret identity she couldn't quite abandon. Other women on Liberty Avenue wore similar tokens. They were religious medals or pieces of jewelry that represented connections to lives they had left behind or hoped to reclaim. Sophie told herself that the work was temporary, that she was saving money to go back to school or move to a different city where no one knew her history. But savings proved impossible to build when every dollar earned was immediately needed for rent, food, or the small comforts that made survival bearable. By early 1983, Sophie had been living in Pittsburgh for more than 2 years. That was long enough that the city's rhythms had become familiar, that she knew which streets to avoid at certain hours and which customers could be trusted to follow the rules of transactions, done in car back seats or cheap motel rooms. She was 19 years old but looked older, aged by circumstances that had compressed years of experience into shortened time. Her blonde hair, which had been carefully kept during her Erie childhood, now hung limp and unevenly cut. Her blue eyes carried a weariness that came from constant watchfulness in places where violence was always possible. On the evening of March 13, 1983, Sophie called her mother from a payphone outside the Greyhound terminal. It was the same building where she had arrived in Pittsburgh more than 2 years earlier. The phone call lasted 11 minutes. It was documented later by telephone company records that Detective Horvath would request during his investigation. Diane would replay the conversation thousands of times in the decades that followed, searching for meanings she might have missed, warnings she should have noticed. Sophie had sounded tired but not upset, mentioning that she was thinking about leaving Pittsburgh, that the city had become dangerous in ways she hadn't initially understood. Diane had asked where she would go, and Sophie had said she didn't know yet. Maybe back to Erie, maybe somewhere completely new. The conversation ended with Sophie promising to call again soon. It was a promise that would never be kept. Diane returned the phone to its holder in her Erie apartment at 10:47 p.m. She didn't know that she had just heard her daughter's voice for the final time. The corner of Liberty Avenue and 10th Street was in a changing area in downtown Pittsburgh. The business district's daytime legitimacy gave way each evening to the economy of crime that had operated in those blocks for decades. By March 1983, the area had earned a reputation that kept regular citizens away after dark. They were replaced by men who drove slowly in vehicles with out-of-state plates and women who stood beneath streetlights in clothing calculated to advertise availability, while providing minimal protection against the late winter cold. Sophie Brooks took her usual position on that corner at about 10:30 p.m. on March 13, 1983. It was a Sunday evening when business was typically slower than weekends but steady enough to make the work worthwhile. She wore her brown wool coat over a short denim skirt and boots that had been bought from a second-hand store on Smithfield Street 3 weeks earlier. The temperature stayed around 38 degrees. It was cold enough that her breath formed visible clouds in the orange glow of the streetlights, but not quite freezing enough to drive the working women into the temporary shelter of doorways and alleys. 3 other women worked that particular corner on Sunday evenings. It was a loose arrangement that provided safety in numbers while keeping enough distance to avoid competition for customers. Detective Horvath would later interview all 3 women. He documented their observations with the careful attention that characterized his investigation despite its ultimate failure to create useful leads. Crystal Martinez, age 23, told Horvath that Sophie had seemed distracted that evening, less engaged in the casual conversation that typically passed time between customers. Martinez worked at the northeast corner of the intersection. She had known Sophie for about 8 months. That was long enough to recognize changes in her usual behavior. When pressed for specifics, Martinez described Sophie as like she was thinking about something else, not really paying attention to what was happening around her. Martinez had last seen Sophie at about 10:55 p.m., still standing on her corner, still waiting for the next vehicle to slow down and judge whether she met the driver's needs. Teresa Washington, age 19, worked the southwest corner. She provided the most detailed account of Sophie's final known movements. Washington remembered watching a dark-colored Chevrolet Impala, possibly 1978 or 1979 model, make 2 slow passes along Liberty Avenue before pulling to the curb near where Sophie stood. The vehicle had circled the block once. This was a common pattern among customers who wanted to look at available options before committing to a transaction. On its second approach, the Impala stopped directly in front of Sophie. Washington watched Sophie lean toward the driver's window for what appeared to be a brief negotiation. It was a conversation that lasted less than 30 seconds before Sophie opened the passenger door and climbed inside. Washington noted this detail specifically because many of the women working Liberty Avenue preferred to talk through closed windows before entering vehicles. This was a safety precaution that provided an extra moment to judge whether a customer seemed dangerous. Sophie's willingness to enter the Impala quickly suggested either familiarity with the driver or economic desperation that overrode caution. The Impala pulled away from the curb at 11:03 p.m. It turned right onto 10th Street and disappeared into the sparse late-night traffic that characterized downtown Pittsburgh on Sunday evenings. Washington remembered looking at her watch specifically because she had been tracking how long she had been working without customers, calculating whether the slow night justified staying on the corner or returning to her hotel room. She did not see the vehicle's license plate clearly enough to record numbers or figure out what state had issued the registration. Linda Chen, age 28, worked the northwest corner. She provided limited information to Horvath during her interview. Chen had been dealing with a customer when Sophie entered the Impala and did not see the departure. However, Chen mentioned that Sophie had told her earlier in the evening about the phone call with her mother. She specifically noted that Sophie had seemed different after talking to her mom, like maybe she was thinking about getting out of this life. Chen's statement introduced a complication into the investigation. It suggested that Sophie might have left Pittsburgh willingly rather than falling victim to foul play. This uncertainty would trouble the investigation for weeks, as Horvath struggled to determine whether he was looking for a missing person who had chosen to disappear or a victim of kidnapping. Sophie failed to return to her single-room hotel at the Penn Liberty Apartments. This detail wasn't immediately noticed because residents of such places kept irregular schedules, and the hotel's management did not monitor comings and goings with any particular attention. The hotel was in a 4-story brick building built in 1924. It was long past its modest prime, split into narrow rooms that rented by the week to people whose circumstances prevented them from getting conventional housing. Sophie's room, number 312, measured about 10 feet by 12 feet. It contained a narrow bed, a dresser with a cracked mirror, and a hot plate that violated the building's fire codes but was tolerated by management that understood residents needed some way of preparing food. The first solid sign that something had gone wrong came on Wednesday, March 16th, when Raymond Mitchell discovered Sophie's coat during his regular trash collection route. Mitchell worked for the city's Department of Public Works. He had been collecting commercial trash in downtown Pittsburgh for 11 years. That was long enough to recognize items that seemed inconsistent with typical disposal patterns. The coat had been stuffed into a dumpster behind the Greyhound bus terminal on 11th Street, about 6 blocks from where Sophie was last seen entering the Impala. Mitchell noticed the coat because blood staining on the shoulder had soaked through the brown wool, creating a dark patch that stood out against the surrounding fabric. He used a metal hook to pull the coat from the dumpster. He immediately recognized that the item likely represented evidence in some form of violent crime. The coat's right shoulder showed tears in the fabric consistent with forceful pulling or struggling, and the wool was matted with what appeared to be dried blood in an amount suggesting serious injury. Mitchell placed the coat in a plastic bag he got from his truck. He drove it directly to the Zone 2 police station on the north side, arriving at 9:45 a.m. with evidence that would become central to the investigation into Sophie Brooks's disappearance. Diane Brooks got the phone call from Detective Paul Horvath at 2:30 p.m. on March 17, 1983. It was 4 days after her final conversation with Sophie. Horvath had gotten Diane's contact information from documents Sophie kept in her hotel room. This included letters from her mother that Sophie had saved in a cardboard shoebox beneath her bed. The letters spanned more than 2 years. They were evidence of Diane's persistent attempts to keep connection with a daughter who had vanished into a life that Diane could neither understand nor accept. Horvath's call was brief and professional. It was structured around questions about when Diane had last heard from Sophie, whether Sophie had mentioned plans to leave Pittsburgh, and whether Diane knew of anyone who might wish to harm her daughter. Diane answered mechanically. Her voice carried the flatness that comes with shock too deep for immediate emotional processing. She provided Horvath with Sophie's birth date, physical description, and medical history. This included blood type O positive, information that would be cross-checked against the blood found on Sophie's recovered coat. The blood analysis done by the Allegheny County Crime Laboratory confirmed that the stains on Sophie's coat matched her documented blood type, but more definite identification was impossible with 1983 forensic abilities. The amount of blood suggested injuries serious enough to need medical attention, and the distribution pattern showed it had soaked into the fabric while Sophie was wearing the coat rather than being transferred from another source. The laboratory report concluded that Sophie Brooks had likely been injured seriously on the night of March 13th, and that the coat had been thrown away by someone trying to dispose of evidence connecting them to her disappearance. Detective Horvath filed Sophie's missing person report with the FBI National Crime Information Center on March 18th. This expanded the investigation beyond Pittsburgh's boundaries to include regional law enforcement agencies throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The NCIC report described Sophie as a missing endangered adult. This was a classification that reflected both her age and the evidence suggesting violence. Horvath personally contacted police departments in Erie, Youngstown, Cleveland, and Wheeling. He provided Sophie's description and asked for notification if any Jane Doe cases matched her physical characteristics. The investigation got more intense during the final 2 weeks of March, with Horvath doing interviews throughout the Liberty Avenue area and reviewing records from local hospitals and morgues. He got surveillance footage from businesses near where Sophie was last seen, but the limited camera coverage available in 1983 gave no useful images of the Impala or its driver. He contacted the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation to request lists of registered Chevrolet Impalas matching the description provided by Teresa Washington. This created more than 4,000 potential vehicles registered in western Pennsylvania alone. By early April, the investigation had reached the unavoidable plateau where active leads were used up, and further progress required either new evidence or extraordinary luck. Horvath's case file had grown to nearly 200 pages of reports, witness statements, and paperwork, but none of it brought him closer to figuring out what had happened to Sophie Brooks after she entered that dark Impala on a cold Sunday evening in March. The coat remained in evidence storage, kept for the possibility that future forensic abilities might pull out information invisible to current technology. Sophie's hotel room was photographed and documented before the landlord cleared it to rent to another tenant. Her few belongings were recorded and stored in a box that would eventually move to the basement of the Allegheny County Courthouse. Sophie Ann Brooks had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. She left behind only a blood-stained coat and unanswered questions that would haunt everyone who had known her. Diane Brooks made her first trip to Pittsburgh on March 22, 1983. It was 9 days after Sophie's disappearance. She drove her falling apart 1976 Ford Granada, the 130 miles from Erie, with a cardboard box of photographs sitting on the passenger seat. The photographs showed Sophie at various ages, from elementary school portraits with carefully combed hair and forced smiles to more recent snapshots that Diane had collected from the few letters Sophie had sent home. Diane had photocopied each image at the Erie Public Library, creating stacks of flyers that she planned to hand out throughout the city where her daughter had vanished. The Pittsburgh that Diane saw looked nothing like the polished downtown area that would appear decades later. Steel production had declined sharply through the late 70s and early 80s, leaving the city economically ruined and struggling to reimagine its identity. Abandoned factories lined the rivers. Their broken windows and rusting infrastructure stood as monuments to an industrial era that was ending with brutal finality. The streets Diane walked, handing out her photocopied flyers, were filled with people who carried their own desperation, who had learned to look past the suffering of strangers as a way of protecting themselves from empathy they couldn't afford. Detective Horvath met with Diane at the Zone 2 police station during her first visit. He reviewed the investigation's progress with the careful language of someone who understood he was delivering information that would define the rest of this woman's life. He explained about the recovered coat, the blood evidence, the witness statements from Liberty Avenue, and the limitations that held back his ability to pursue an investigation that had produced no body, no suspect, and no clear sign of what crime had been committed. Horvath did not use the phrase assumed dead in Diane's presence, but the meaning saturated every sentence of their conversation. Diane returned to Pittsburgh monthly through 1983 and 1984. Each trip followed the same ritual pattern. She would arrive early on Saturday mornings when the streets were less crowded. She would park near the Greyhound terminal where Sophie's coat had been discovered and spend hours walking the downtown area, showing photographs to anyone who would pause long enough to look. She approached women working the Liberty Avenue corners, offering money not for services but for information. She asked whether anyone remembered seeing Sophie after March 13th, or knew anything about the dark Impala that had become central to her personal story. Most encounters produced only apologetic silence or made-up stories designed to get money from a grieving mother desperate for any scrap of hope. The relationship between Diane and Detective Horvath changed into something resembling mutual tiredness. As months passed without progress, Horvath continued investigating Sophie's case when his schedule allowed, but the demands of active investigations necessarily took priority over a missing person case that had gone cold within weeks of its start. He answered Diane's phone calls with patient courtesy. He updated her on developments that were increasingly paperwork-related rather than investigative. These were notifications from other areas that had found no matching Jane does. Laboratory reports that confirmed what was already known but provided no new insights. Bureaucratic updates about file transfers and evidence storage procedures. By 1985, Diane's visits to Pittsburgh had taken on a quality that worried even the women who worked Liberty Avenue and had initially helped with her questions. She began carrying a notebook filled with increasingly complex theories about what had happened to Sophie. It included diagrams connecting Sophie's disappearance to other missing person cases she had read about in newspapers and true crime magazines. She spoke about trafficking rings and organized criminal networks with a certainty not supported by evidence. She was building explanatory frameworks that provided meaning to circumstances that might simply have been random. Violence done by an opportunistic predator. The psychological decline was gradual enough that Diane herself didn't recognize the change. She stopped accepting extra shifts at the hospital. She was unable to focus on patient care when her mind was consumed with analyzing every detail of Sophie's case. Her apartment in Erie became a place for storing documentation. There were maps of Pittsburgh marked with locations where other women had disappeared, photographs of men arrested for similar crimes in neighboring states, letters to FBI agents and state lawmakers that grew increasingly desperate in tone and disconnected from evidence reality. The careful handwriting of her early letters gave way to handwriting that slanted and cramped as pages went on. It was a physical sign of a mind struggling to process grief too large to be contained. Horvath retired from the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police in July 1991. It was 26 years after joining the force and 8 years after Sophie Brooks had disappeared. His retirement party was held at a restaurant on Mount Washington with views looking over the Three Rivers. It was attended by colleagues who shared stories about cases solved and criminals caught during a career that had been objectively successful by every measure except the one that haunted Horvath most persistently. He did not mention Sophie Brooks during the speeches and toasts, but her case file was among the materials he boxed up from his desk on his final day. There were documents he would keep at his home because giving them up felt like abandoning Sophie to permanent obscurity. The case was given to Detective William Brantley. He inherited a filing cabinet full of cold cases along with his promotion to the Criminal Investigation Division. Brantley reviewed Sophie's file with the dutiful attention of someone fulfilling professional duties rather than personal investment. He contacted Diane Brooks as a courtesy. He explained that he would be the new point of contact for Sophie's case but offered no false promises about renewed investigative effort. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It was time enough for Brantley to understand that Diane's expectations had become disconnected from what was realistically possible given the complete absence of new leads. Diane's final trip to Pittsburgh happened in September 2001. It was 18 years after Sophie's disappearance, during a period when the entire nation was consumed with the aftermath of attacks that had killed thousands and reshaped American understanding about vulnerability and loss. Diane drove the familiar route from Erie, now behind the wheel of a 1994 Buick that represented her only major purchase in the preceding decade. She was 56 years old but looked 70, aged by nearly 2 decades of grief that had consumed her physical health along with her emotional stability. She spent 3 days in Pittsburgh during that final visit, walking routes that had become sacred geography in her internal landscape: Liberty Avenue, 10th Street, the Greyhound Terminal, the police station where she had first met Detective Horvath 18 years earlier. She carried photographs that had faded from repeated handling. Sophie's face was becoming unclear in images that had been copied and recopied until detail was lost to repeated copying. The women who worked Liberty Avenue in 2001 were different individuals from those who had known Sophie. It was a complete turnover that happened in professions where longevity was rare and survival meant eventual escape to different circumstances or death that removed women from street corners with efficient regularity. Diane checked into a motel on the north side. It was the same place where she had stayed during previous visits. It was a budget place that charged $38 per night for a room that smelled of industrial cleaning products, inadequately masking decades of cigarette smoke. She spent the evening organizing her files, preparing for a meeting she had scheduled with the district attorney's office for the following morning. The meeting, when it happened, lasted 20 minutes. It consisted mainly of a junior prosecutor explaining with practiced sympathy that Sophie's case remained open but inactive, that without new evidence there was no basis for renewed investigation, that the passage of time had made resolution increasingly unlikely. Diane Brooks died of spreading lung cancer on February 8, 2003, at Hammett Medical Center in Erie. It was the same hospital where Sophie had been born 38 years and 10 months earlier. She had been diagnosed only 6 weeks before her death. The cancer was already advanced beyond treatment when discovered during an emergency room visit for breathing problems. Her final days were spent in a hospice facility where morphine dulled the physical pain but could not address the deep anguish of dying without ever learning what had happened to her daughter. The apartment on West 22nd Street was cleaned out by a cousin Diane hadn't spoken to in years. It was a family member close enough to be contacted by the hospital, but distant enough that sorting through Diane's belongings felt like archaeological investigation of a stranger's life. The apartment contained almost nothing of conventional value. There was furniture bought second-hand decades earlier, clothing worn thin from repeated washing, kitchen items that had been cheap when new and were now simply outdated. But Sophie's room, kept exactly as it had been in 1980 when Sophie left, it remained a shrine to maternal devotion and unprocessed loss. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten timelines documenting 20 years of investigative obsession. Diane had marked locations throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia where women had disappeared. She drew lines connecting cases she believed were related to Sophie's kidnapping. She had kept letters with other families of missing women. The files contained dozens of letters exchanged with mothers and fathers who shared her particular type of grief. Most heartbreaking were the unsent letters addressed to Sophie herself. They were dated letters spanning 2 decades in which Diane wrote about daily events, holiday celebrations, and the persistent hope that Sophie would somehow return to read about the life that had continued during her absence. The cousin boxed everything and delivered it to a storage unit that would be rented for 6 months, before being auctioned when rental payments stopped. Most of Diane's collected materials were eventually thrown away by whoever bought the unit's contents. They were deemed worthless by people who couldn't understand the importance of documents that represented one woman's refusal to accept that her daughter had been erased from existence. Sophie's case file at the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police was moved to archive storage in the Allegheny County Courthouse basement. There it joined thousands of other unsolved cases in a climate-controlled place that kept paper documents from deteriorating while offering no way to solve the crimes they documented. 20 years after Sophie Brooks disappeared and only months after her mother died, still searching for answers, the case existed only as archived documentation. It was waiting for technology or circumstance to provide investigative abilities that hadn't existed in 1983. Detective Marcus Chen joined the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police Cold Case Unit in January 2015. He was transferred from the Homicide Division after 12 years of investigating crimes where trails were still warm and witnesses still living. The cold case assignment represented either a professional dead end or an opportunity for meaningful work depending on perspective. Chen chose to view it as the latter. He understood that unsolved cases represented failures of justice that haunted communities and families long after public attention moved elsewhere. The cold case unit was in a cramped office suite on the 3rd floor of the city building. 3 detectives shared space originally designed for 2, surrounded by filing cabinets containing decades of unresolved investigations. Chen's first assignment was doing an audit of evidence storage facilities. It was an administrative task that seemed designed to help him adjust to the bureaucratic realities of cold case work. The Allegheny County Courthouse basement contained evidence dating back to the 1960s. There were thousands of boxes organized, according to systems that had changed multiple times over the decades. This created a chaotic archive where finding specific items required patience and systematic method. Chen discovered Sophie Brooks's case file on a humid afternoon in August 2015 during his 3rd week of inventory work. The box had been missing in a section meant for property crimes rather than violent offenses. It was a cataloging error that had effectively hidden Sophie's evidence from previous review efforts. The cardboard showed water damage from a pipe leak that maintenance records showed had happened in 1997. There were brown stains along the bottom edges and a musty odor suggesting long exposure to moisture. Chen almost passed over the box entirely, assuming it contained documents too damaged to be useful. But something about the handwritten label, Brooks Sophie Ann, 1983, made him pause. The evidence inventory inside revealed 32 items collected during the original investigation. Most were routine materials that had given no useful information 3 decades earlier. But evidence item 7, Sophie's brown wool coat, represented something different. Chen understood immediately that the coat might contain biological evidence, recoverable through forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1983. He photographed the evidence bag according to updated chain of custody rules. He documented the coat's condition before authorizing its transfer to the Pennsylvania State Police DNA Laboratory in Greensburg. The laboratory's response came 14 weeks later. It was delayed by backlogs that were chronic in state forensic facilities handling evidence from hundreds of areas. The report confirmed that advanced methods had successfully recovered genetic material from skin cells kept in the wool fibers of Sophie's coat. The DNA profile was partial but enough for a database comparison. It had enough genetic markers to be entered into CODIS with reasonable confidence of producing a match if the perpetrator's profile existed in the system. Chen submitted the profile to CODIS in February 2016. He understood that a match was unlikely but necessary to use up all available investigative paths. The database search returned no hits. This meant that whoever had left DNA on Sophie's coat had never been arrested for crimes requiring genetic sample collection or had committed their crimes before DNA collection. Rules were put in place or had died before their profile could be entered into the system. Chen documented the negative result and moved on to other cases. He understood that cold case work consisted mainly of eliminating possibilities rather than discovering solutions. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In 2018, forensic genetic genealogy appeared as a revolutionary investigative technique, following its successful use in identifying the Golden State Killer after decades of failed traditional investigation. The method involved uploading crime scene DNA profiles to public genealogy databases where people voluntarily shared genetic information to discover family connections. Forensic genealogists could then build family trees, identifying potential suspects through shared ancestry. It was a process that got around the limitations of law enforcement databases limited to convicted criminals. Chen attended a training conference in Harrisburg in March 2019. Genetic genealogist Caroline Mitchell presented case studies showing the technique's effectiveness in solving cold cases that had resisted traditional investigation for decades. Mitchell explained the process of uploading DNA profiles to GEDmatch and other public databases, identifying genetic matches among distant relatives, and building family trees backward through historical records to identify living descendants who might have contributed crime scene DNA. The method was time-intensive and required expertise in both genetics and genealogical research, but it had already solved dozens of cases that had seemed permanently unsolvable. Chen returned to Pittsburgh convinced that genetic genealogy represented Sophie Brooks's best chance for resolution after 36 years. He submitted a formal request to the district attorney's office, seeking authorization and funding for forensic genealogy analysis of the DNA recovered from Sophie's coat. The request required 3 months of bureaucratic review, budget negotiations and legal consultations about the admissibility of evidence gotten from genealogy databases, but it was ultimately approved in July 2019 with funding authorized for 6 months of genealogical research. Caroline Mitchell accepted the contract in August 2019. She received Sophie's DNA profile along with case documentation that Chen had compiled summarizing the 1983 investigation. Mitchell uploaded the profile to GEDmatch under rules established for law enforcement use of the database. This started a search that would compare Sophie's perpetrator's genetic markers against about 1.3 million user profiles, looking for matches showing shared ancestry. The initial search produced 17 potential matches ranging from second cousins to fourth cousins. These were genetic relationships distant enough that building connecting family trees would require extensive historical research, but close enough to be genealogically useful. Mitchell spent 11 weeks building family trees for each genetic match. She worked backward through birth certificates, marriage records, census documents, and death certificates to identify common ancestors. The research revealed that several of Sophie's perpetrator's distant relatives shared ancestry traced to German immigrants who had settled in Western Pennsylvania during the 1840s. Mitchell's genealogical reconstruction identified a family named Tucker. Their descendants included 3 males who would have been between 20 and 40 years old in 1983 and living within 50 miles of Pittsburgh. 2 of the 3 candidates were still living and agreed to provide voluntary DNA samples that excluded them as contributors to the evidence on Sophie's coat. The 3rd candidate was Gerald Wayne Tucker, who had died in 2018 at age 64. Mitchell's research revealed that Tucker's DNA profile had been collected in 2016 following an arrest in Ohio for domestic violence. The sample had been entered into CODIS after his death in early 2019 when Ohio expanded its database inclusion rules to include serious misdemeanors along with felonies. Chen submitted a formal request to compare Gerald Tucker's CODIS profile against the DNA recovered from Sophie Brooks's coat. The comparison was completed on November 14, 2019. Chen received the results the following morning. The genetic markers matched with statistical probability enough to conclude that Gerald Wayne Tucker had been in physical contact with Sophie Brooks on the night she disappeared. His skin cells had transferred to her coat during circumstances that the evidence suggested had been violent. After 36 years, Sophie's case finally had a suspect whose identity that could be proven through science that hadn't existed when Detective Horvath had first investigated her disappearance. Chen spent the afternoon of November 15 researching Gerald Tucker's background. He discovered a criminal history that should have made him a suspect in 1983. If Arias had had the communication, systems and database abilities to recognize patterns across geographic boundaries, Tucker had been living in Pittsburgh during Sophie's disappearance. He had a documented history of violence against women, and he had been arrested for asking for prostitution in the same Liberty Avenue area where Sophie had worked. He had continued committing crimes for 35 years after killing Sophie. He was protected by investigative limitations and a criminal justice system that treated violence against sex workers as misdemeanors not worthy of serious consequences. The notification that appeared on Chen's computer screen that gray November morning represented both victory and tragedy. the victory that persistence and technology had finally solved the case that had seemed permanently closed. Tragedy that justice was coming 3.5 decades too late to prevent Gerald Tucker from living an entire adult life, despite having murdered a 19-year-old woman whose only crime had been survival in circumstances that offered few alternatives. Detective Marcus Chen made the drive to St. Clairsville, Ohio, on November 18, 2019. It was 3 days after getting confirmation that Gerald Wayne Tucker's DNA matched evidence recovered from Sophie Brooks's coat. The journey took 2 hours along Interstate 70, crossing the Pennsylvania-Ohio border through landscape that remained largely unchanged from the industrial corridor it had been in 1983, when Tucker had murdered Sophie and returned to whatever version of normal life he kept between acts of violence. The Belmont Correctional Institution sat on 200 acres of former farmland outside St. Clairsville, was a medium-security facility housing about 1,500 inmates serving sentences for crimes ranging from drug trafficking to serious assault. Tucker had been locked up since August 2018, following his conviction for serious assault and domestic violence. He was sentenced to 4 years with possibility of parole after 18 months. He was scheduled for a parole hearing in February 2020, a possibility that Chen's investigation would make permanently meaningless. The interview room where Chen met Gerald Wayne Tucker was designed for attorney-client meetings. It was a windowless space containing a metal table bolted to concrete flooring and plastic chairs that had been selected because they couldn't be used as weapons. Tucker entered at 2:15 p.m., escorted by a corrections officer who remained stationed outside the locked door. Tucker was 64 years old but looked older. His gray hair was cut in the institutional style common to men who had spent significant portions of their lives locked up. He moved with the careful slowness of someone whose body had been damaged by decades of heavy labor, alcohol abuse, and violence, both inflicted and received. Chen introduced himself and explained that he was investigating the 1983 disappearance of Sophie Ann Brooks in Pittsburgh. Tucker's face showed no recognition at Sophie's name. This lack of reaction was something Chen had learned could mean either genuine ignorance or practiced deception. Chen laid 3 photographs on the table between them. There was Sophie's high school portrait from 1982, a crime scene photograph of a bloodstained coat, and a forensic diagram illustrating DNA match statistics. He explained methodically about genetic evidence, CODUS databases, and forensic genealogy techniques that had identified Tucker as the source of biological material found on Sophie's coat 36 years after her disappearance. Tucker remained silent throughout Chen's presentation. His pale blue eyes moved between the photographs without apparent emotion. When Chen finished speaking, Tucker leaned back in his plastic chair and asked for a lawyer. It was the automatic response of someone who had been arrested enough times to understand that nothing he said could improve his circumstances. Chen ended the interview according to protocol. He understood that Tucker's request for a lawyer would delay questioning but ultimately made little difference when DNA evidence was conclusive regardless of confession. The formal charges were filed in Allegheny County Court on December 2, 2019. Gerald Wayne Tucker was charged with 1 count of criminal homicide in the death of Sophie Ann Brooks, along with related charges of kidnapping and abuse of corpse. The criminal complaint detailed evidence that Tucker had asked Sophie for prostitution on the night of March 13, 1983, that a violent fight had happened resulting in Sophie's death, and that Tucker had disposed of her body in a location that remained unknown despite extensive searching of areas Tucker had been to during the relevant time period. The DNA evidence was presented as conclusive proof of physical contact between Tucker and Sophie on the night she disappeared. It was contact that Tucker would need to explain in any defense that didn't involve admission of guilt. Tucker's court-appointed attorney, Robert Castilla, negotiated a plea agreement during January 2020 that avoided trial in exchange for Tucker's cooperation in telling the location of Sophie's remains. The negotiations revealed details that Chen documented in reports, written with clinical precision that barely contained his rage at the casual brutality Tucker described. Tucker admitted that he had picked up Sophie on Liberty Avenue and driven to an isolated area along the Monongahela River south of Pittsburgh and tried to force sexual contact beyond what had been negotiated. When Sophie resisted and threatened to report him to police, Tucker strangled her. It was a process he described with emotional detachment, suggesting he had replayed the memory enough times that it no longer carried moral weight. Tucker claimed he had panicked after realizing Sophie was dead. He drove with her body in his vehicle for several hours while deciding how to dispose of evidence connecting him to her death. He eventually drove Sophie's body to an abandoned coal mine in Washington County, about 40 miles southwest of Pittsburgh. He accessed the site through broken fencing that no longer existed. By 2020, he had carried Sophie's body into the mine shaft and left it in a chamber that later flooding had likely made inaccessible. Tucker had kept Sophie's silver crucifix as a trophy, wearing it occasionally until losing it during a bar fight in Youngstown in 1987. It was a detail he recounted with the same emotional flatness that characterized his entire confession. On February 14, 2020, Gerald Wayne Tucker pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, kidnapping, an abusive corpse in a plea agreement that sentenced him to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The hearing lasted 37 minutes. It was conducted before Judge Patricia Morrison in a courtroom where the only viewers were Detective Chen, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Klein, and two reporters covering the resolution of a case that happened before they were born. Tucker made no statement beyond the legally required acknowledgement that he understood the charges and was pleading guilty voluntarily. Judge Morrison sentenced him without comment beyond what was legally required. She understood that nothing she could say would adequately address the decades of suffering Tucker had inflicted or the institutional failures that had allowed him to remain free for 36 years after murdering Sophie Brooks. Chen spent the following weeks trying to find any surviving family members who should be told of the case's resolution. His research confirmed what he had suspected. Diane Brooks had died in 2003 without ever learning what happened to her daughter. Sophie had no siblings, and the extended family that might have existed had been lost to time, death, and the geographic spread that characterized American families in the late 20th century. The only memorial Chen could arrange was administrative. He updated Sophie's missing person file to show that her case was closed, her death confirmed, and her killer identified and convicted. The Pennsylvania State Police conducted a search of the abandoned mine site Tucker had identified in Washington County during March 2020. They used ground radar and specialized recovery teams trained in hazardous environment extraction. The search was complicated by structural instability and water buildup that had happened over nearly 4 decades. After 2 weeks of systematic investigation, the team recovered skeletal remains from a flooded chamber about 300 feet into the mine complex. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Hayes confirmed that the remains matched a female between 18 and 25 years old, about 5 feet 4 inches tall, deceased for 30 to 40 years. DNA analysis confirmed what Chen already knew. The remains were Sophie Ann Brooks. Sophie was buried on April 18, 2020, in a plot beside her mother in Calvary Cemetery in Erie, Pennsylvania. Chen arranged and paid for the funeral himself when it became clear that no family existed to take responsibility. The service was attended by Chen's father Michael Doherty from St. Patrick's Church, who had known Diane Brooks during her final years, and 3 women who had worked Liberty Avenue in the 1980s and remembered Sophie as someone who had shown them kindness in circumstances where kindness was rare. The cemetery was quiet except for wind moving through trees that had been saplings when Sophie disappeared. They were mature now in ways Sophie would never be. Chen stood beside the grave after others had left. He looked at the simple headstone he had selected. Sophie Brooks, April 3, 1964, March 13, 1983. Beloved daughter. The inscription was inadequate. It was unable to capture the complexity of a life lived in desperation and ended in violence. But it was unable to acknowledge the decades of maternal grief that had consumed Diane Brooks. It was unable to address the institutional indifference that had allowed Sophie's case to remain unsolved for 36 years, because her life was considered less valuable than others. In the months following Tucker's conviction, Chen started a comprehensive review of unsolved cases involving sex workers from the 1980s and 1990s throughout western Pennsylvania. His research identified 17 additional disappearances that shared characteristics with Sophie's case. They were young women working in street prostitution, last seen entering vehicles with unidentified men. Investigations that got minimal resources and were closed quickly without resolution. Chen cross-referenced these cases against Tucker's known locations and criminal history. He identified at least 4 cases where circumstantial evidence suggested possible involvement. Tucker refused to cooperate with investigation of additional crimes. He calculated correctly that he had nothing to gain and potentially additional legal liability from further admissions. The Sophie Ann Brooks case was formally closed on May 1, 2020. It was 37 years and 2 months after her disappearance. The case file, expanded now to include DNA analysis reports, forensic genealogy documentation, and Tucker's confession, was archived digitally. Copies were kept by the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office, and the Pennsylvania State Police. The physical evidence, including Sophie's coat and the recovered remains, was kept according to rules requiring indefinite preservation of materials related to solved homicides. Chen received no award or public recognition for solving Sophie's case. Cold case resolutions rarely created the attention given to active investigations, and Sophie's status as a sex worker meant that even her successful prosecution attracted minimal media coverage beyond brief newspaper articles noting Tucker's conviction. But Chen understood that justice had never been about recognition or attention. It was about making sure that Sophie Ann Brooks was no longer just a name in a missing person file, that her death was acknowledged and her killer held accountable, that someone had cared enough to pursue truth even when pursuing it served no institutional interest. On the evening after Sophie's burial, Chen returned to his office and pulled the next cold case file from the cabinet where dozens of unsolved investigations waited for someone to apply new technologies and persistent attention to evidence that had been collected decades earlier. The file contained photographs of another young woman who had disappeared in circumstances that suggested violence. It was another family that had spent years without answers. It was another failure of justice waiting to be addressed by someone who understood that time doesn't erase the obligation to pursue truth. Sophie Brooks had received justice. It was incomplete and delayed, but real nonetheless. Somewhere in those files were other Sophies waiting for the same, and Chen would continue opening boxes in courthouse basements until he found them. Make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories. Your support helps bring attention to cases that might otherwise be forgotten. What cold case do you think deserves more attention? Comment below. Every unsolved case represents a family still waiting for answers, still hoping for the closure that finally came to the Brooks family after nearly half a century of searching.